So, Bernard-Henri Lévy, what would you say your job is? You've been described variously as a philosopher, as a journalist, and as a sort of television personality. What would you say you do?
I would say that I have no job. I would not say it is a job. I am all of this, for sure. I'm a writer. I try to do a little philosophy. I try to implement my ideas, and I try to live my ideas too. So all this makes I don't know, a sort of mixture which is hard to define for myself, and maybe hard to be understood for others. For example, this last year in Libya, I was an activist. I did try to exert an influence on the very course of history, on things, but I never lost the idea that all that I was living was to be written, and that the way to prevent things from dying was to make them live through words and through literature and through a book. So all of that at the same time.
In a very sort of hard, in the very hard world of the internet, of media, of instant information gratification on television or on YouTube, etc., what role do you think the written word has to play? Do you think it's a sanctuary or an effective force in order to...
No, I think it is the gold standard of all that. You have many sorts of way of expression. You have the web, you have on the web messages of 140 characters, you have TV and so on, but the reference of all that, the basis, the étalon, as we say in French, is probably the written word. Without that, without literature, without articulated ideas, without philosophy, all the rest would probably be sort of shadow, a sort of vain noise, a sort of fake speech, an empire of emptiness. So it remains the gold standard of all the rest. And considering that, one can use as tools the other ways of expressing. If you hold strongly the line of the very word, of literature, philosophy, ideas, and so on, if you don't do compromise on that, if you stand by your real words, nothing prevents you from making a 1 minute and 20-second appearance on a TV, a BBC show. Nothing prevents you from using Twitter, which I don't do, by the way, but I could do it. But the world has to be the basis of the rest. You are saved. If you do that, you are saved and safe.
Why do you think, speaking to a small academic crowd is less appealing to you than speaking on television to a mass audience?
No, I would not say that it is less appealing, maybe even the contrary. For me, it's more appealing to speak in front of little crowds, seminaries, and so on. It's more appealing. And I'm not even sure that it is less useful. But what I'm sure of is that, again, the best is to use the two regime, is to work on the two speeds, is to go from one to the other. In Paris, for example, I have a sort of very, very little, very tiny show studio, really tiny, which is La Règle du Jeu. And La Règle du Jeu has a weekly seminary in a cinema, which Règle du Jeu own in a part. And every Sunday morning we have a seminary. Sometimes 400, 500 people are there. Sometimes 5 people, really 5, including the staff of La Règle du Jeu. The two are very important. It is two different ways of making the world live, but the two are complementary, and the two don't compete, but complete themselves. And one cannot go without the other one. I remember once I was invited, I think it was in Salt Lake City in America. I was invited for a big, in front of a huge audience, for a big event on the Jewish matters. And I prepared myself for one of these big gatherings where you have to address a big crowd of maybe hundreds, maybe 1,000 people, which is a way of speaking. You don't have to prepare so much, you don't have to. And I made a complete mistake, and I realized my mistake when I was pushed into the room. My real audience was 10 very sophisticated, very learned rabbis coming from all over the world, and some of them from America. And they were the most sophisticated people in Jewish matters, which one probably could find this very day. So this day, of course, it was a little difficult to change, to go from track 1, address a big audience, to track 2, address a little seminary of knowledgeable people. I remember how I was disoriented, of course, but I tried to do it, and when it was finished, I was probably as happy, I would not say more happy, but as happy of this situation than of the reverse. It is two different ways of entering in world.
You've also been known for sort of, as you were saying earlier, activism. But that sort of, started out with your first job, where you were really very sort of active. And I suppose the first thing that one would put in your CV as a kind of employment history was going to Bangladesh. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, it is a long time ago. It is exactly 40 years, by the way. Maybe day for day. Maybe exactly 40 years ago. November 71, there was in Bangladesh a huge bloodbath. Bangladesh belonged at this time, was a part of Pakistan. There was a revolt and uprising of the people of Bangladesh against the central rule of Pakistan. And there happened probably the first beginning of genocide, maybe genocide of the post-World War II. Even today the figures are not well known. Even today we don't know if it is 200,000 dead or maybe 1 million. It's a very obscure story. And the world was rather indifferent to that, as always, to be frank. And there was at this time an old great French writer, whom you know, of course. We spoke of him, you and me, once a few years ago, André Malraux, one of the greatest French writers of the 20th century. André Malraux, who was a communist in his youth, who did fight during the Spanish War on the side of the Republicans, and who was very old at this moment. He had been Minister of General de Gaulle, and in a sort of last awakening, in a sort of last shoot of life, he went off on TV. He said how disgusted he was by the idea of Bangladesh being in such a bloodbath, and he called for the constitution of an international brigade in order to protect the people of Bangladesh. International brigade, as he did in his youth 40 years before in Spain. And I saw that on TV, and I replied. I enlisted myself. I went to see him, visit to the great writer, which is a sort of genre littéraire as itself in France and probably all over the world. I saw the old André Malraux. I went to Bangladesh to be the vanguard of the International Brigade. It appeared that I was the only one to reply, so the brigade was reduced to myself. I nevertheless remained there. I entered in Dhaka with the Indian troops, and then it was a matter of job. After the liberation of Bangladesh, January 1972, I took a job. I was very young. I was 22 years old. I took the job of advisor for economic questions. I knew nothing about economics, of course, but economics do not really exist, so it was not a real problem, for the newly formed government of Bangladesh. And my first real job was that. I was paid, I remember, $5 a month, which was a huge salary for Bangladesh, $5 a month. And I remained there till I was expelled under the suspicion that I was a Chinese agent, to have the whole story short.
So also at this age you were reading sort of Récemment, or this had been one of your sort of late adolescent, sort of early 20s loves. There is a tension between these, you know, these two different modes, I suppose, in your work. That is again between sort of action and ornament, or not ornament, but elaboration, I suppose. Because on the one hand, a book like Daniel Pearl is a very solid journalistic account, but on the other hand, it's it has a lot of description in it. Do you find yourself struggling with that tension a lot?
It is not a tension, because philosophically, metaphysically, I believe deeply that life is words. I do believe that. As old Jew rabbis or even prophets like Ezekiel, I belong to a tradition who believes that the real stuff of human being, the true DNA is not made out of cells, but out of words. Words is the component of a human being. It is a bet, it is a hypothesis, but metaphysics, at the end of the day, always rely on some fundamental bets. Okay, so my bet is that my unconscious, my deep, my vital bet is that you are made of, that I am made of, that everybody is made of words, which is the idea of Lacan also, who believes when he says that the unconsciousness is shaped as a language, l'inconscient est structuré comme un langage, he means the same. Mm-hmm. He means that the real stuff, the real material is words, we're made of words. So if you really feel that, mm-hmm. it is the same. To write or to act, to investigate or to relate, to put your footsteps in the steps of Daniel Pearl, and to relate your investigation, it is really the same. To spend a night in the little hotel in Islamabad where Daniel Pearl spent his last night of free man, and to tell that in a book, it is the same. To go inside the room of torture where he was kept and then beheaded, mm-hmm. and then buried, to go there, to spend hours there, to breathe the air he did breathe, and to make a chapter of a book of this, it is really the two faces of the, for me, of the same coin. So you can say it as Lacan, you can say it as old rabbis of 19th century, you can say it like Mallarmé. The French poet Mallarmé, when he says le monde est fait pour aboutir à un beau livre, the world is made. The world is made for not only enter, the world, the destiny of the world, the aim of the world is to be transformed into a book. Mm-hmm. Mallarmé really believes that. Le monde est fait pour aboutir à un beau livre not only means that one has to take pieces of the world to make a book, but that the real deep end, deep target of the world is itself. The desire of the world is to find some writers, scriptors, not even writers, scriptors, who will shape it into a book. So, whatever the way you phrase it, the result is the same. There is no tension. There is no double postulation. For me, I feel really that it is the same thing, to live and to write. To write one's life and to live one's writing, it is the two ways of saying the same thing. Live one's writing, write one's life. All the writers I admire and all the activist men of action whom I respect would have endorsed this double formula. It may be Romain Gary or Lord Byron, it may be André Malraux or Lawrence of Arabia, it may be Ernest Hemingway or George Orwell. All these names, I only quote them to illustrate these two ways of deciphering the world: live one's writings, write one's living.
So who would you say is the person who's writing the book that we're living now?
Who is writing the book of what?
The book of cultural capitalism.
Nobody is writing it for the moment because the situation is so new. The turmoil in which we are entering is so big, the predicaments are so unpredictable that nobody really began to tell this story. You have on one side the old euphoric liberals who don't get the point, who did not get the film at all. You have the old Marxist devoted to, still stuck into the 19th century, don't get the meaning of the film too either. So nobody is really on the line.
So somebody like Luc Boltanski, for example, would argue that we're living out a form of capitalism that's been dictated to us by the maxims and slogans of 1968. How do you think 1968 has sort of filtered through into the national consciousness and into management culture, I suppose?
1968 was, first of all, a great moment of poetry, of poetry. And moments of poetry, it does not happen so often in history. You have poetry is generally a glossolalia. It happens for one person, 1 minute, one segment of his life. Poetry is rare. Rare in the time, rare in the crowd. A poetical crowd is really a contradiction in the terms, except May 68. The virtue of this event, its specificity regarding all the revolutions of the past was that. A moment of collective poetry, which is, again, an oxymoron. As if, how would I say, as if all that the surrealists did dream, the Dadaist and the surrealist, all those in the 20s, the 30s who believed in the conjunction of literature and revolution at the same, suddenly did see the prediction to come true. This was May 68. It was the surrealism which was reserved to a few hundreds of people since decades, suddenly becoming the world. The world was surrealistic. André Breton, Louis Aragon were the masters of the time. It was not Lenin, it was not Karl Marx. It was André Breton and Robert Desnos and Louis Aragon who were the master thinkers of this moment. So this is priceless. And for all those who lived this event, which was an event which lasted a few weeks, it's something unforgettable. Then it gave, of course, a new sense of freedom, a new sense of relationship between men and women, people in general. It was a real movement of liberation. For example, all that we consider today to be a sort of acquisition about the women, the feminism, which is one of the very few, maybe the only one, revolution of the 20th century which has been achieved and well achieved, which has not turned out to become a nightmare. Feminism is a conquest of the last decades. Really, the peak of that, the moment of crystallization was May 68. If today the cause of the women has partly won, it is because of May 68. So it reshaped, really, it remolded the social link as never, and this remains. The moment of poetry was a sort of glossolalic moment. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the trace in the moods, in the ways of relating to each other, everlasts till today.
But it also changed the way that people, people interacted with corporations. It changed the way that people worked within corporations, and some say further inculcated us into a system in which, or out of which, it's very difficult to escape and imagine a different world. Slavoj Žižek, for example, says it's very difficult to imagine the end of capitalism And 1968 was certainly a point where where a lot of sort of management rhetoric comes from. How would you interpret that?
It's probably true. I would phrase it in another way than my fellow debater Slavoj Zizek. I would say that May 68, but he's right, is the moment when the idea of revolution, which had failed and had stood again and failed again and so on, May 68 is the moment when the idea as itself stopped to be desirable, stopped to be wishable. The moment 68, not really 68, but the moment around 68. If you see that from far, 68 is a revolution. Of course, I know, from outside and from far, you feel it as a revolution. In reality, it is the moment when the desire of revolution came to its peak, and at the peak, the balloon burst out. And for reasons in which one could enter, but it will be it will be hard to enter into details, but in few sentences, I would say that May 68, from May 68 to 75, 76, Chinese Cultural Revolution, Cambodia, and so on, the revolution, it is the first moment in human history where revolution was taken really seriously. It is the first moment where some thinkers did wonder why revolutions so regularly failed in the past, found why, because the revolutions did not go far enough, discovered how far a revolution should go. This is May 68. Discovered, for example, that a revolution, to be serious, to be radical, to go to the roots, to be radical meaning to go to the roots, had to revolution the very language of the humans, had to change the very way we have to desire the world or each other's, has to reshape the real deep roots of the consciousness of mankind. And these thinkers of this May 68 moment discovered also that if you do that, if you push revolution to the end, if you really radicalize the idea, if you really go and fetch the roots of slavery where they are, which is in the depth of the desire and of the word of mankind, then you give birth to terrible world, to barbarity. This is the real lesson of May 68. If you take revolution seriously, if you go to fetch, to find and to eradicate the real roots of slavery, then by a series of theorems, of consequences, then you arrive at Cambodia, you arrive at the peak of Chinese revolution, which was also the peak of the blood, the depth of the bloodbath, and you arrive at the low which was expressed by Michel Foucault in 1976 in a conversation for Le Nouvel Observateur with me, when Michel Foucault said, our senior intellectuals wondered during decades if revolution was possible. Our generation has discovered that the real question is not is revolution possible, but is the revolution desirable? Is it wishable? And the reply of Michel Foucault, which was the reply of Jacques Lacan, by the way, which was the melancholic implicit reply of Jacques Derrida, melancholic and full of sorrow, was no, not wishable. Some said that with joy and happiness, others with deep sorrow and regret, but on the whole, this moment, the characteristic of this moment was what I'm trying to tell you, taking the idea seriously, to push it to its ultimate consequences for the first time in probably mankind, the history of mankind, and to discover that then the consequence being the proof of the origin in a way, the result is as terrible as what was happening under our eyes, for example, in Cambodia. When you look at Pol Pot, Queues sans fond, all these people who are tried now, some of them, those who are not dead, in Cambodia, they were really the most serious revolutionaries of all times. They really decided to rebuild the Cambodian language because they knew as Ferdinand de Saussure, as Roman Jakobson, as all the serious linguists, that slavery was mixed with the language, that it was the real tissue, the real material of the language, for example. So they changed the language. They decided to make some laws about weddings, about relationship between men and women, because they knew, as Charles Baudelaire and as Sigmund Freud, that desire is not just a neutral thing, that it is, again, the very concrete with which, the very brick with which you build the house of slavery and oppression. But when we take out the brick, you have, this was the discovery they made, and we made watching them, you have a house even much more terrible, which is a house of torture. This is May 68. It is not exactly the idea of Zizek.
Are you saying that that if you remove ideology, you acquire barbarism, or
no.
you find barbarism?
No.
Or ideology in the sense of Althusser, for example.
It depends what you mean by ideology. Ideology, if you mean the thought who think when you don't think, the mechanical thought, let's remove ideology, of course. If you mean ideas, a real elaboration of ideas and words, I think that the time has never stopped to be the time of ideologies, and today more than ever we have to be ideologists.
But if the ideology is merely a sort of ideological state apparatus, you know, if you remove, are you saying that there has to be some sort of repressive state, I suppose?
No. I'm saying that, thanks God, there is other ideologies than those who announce and organize the remolding of mankind. If ideology means to take mankind as a material and to make a new man out of it on the ashes of the old one, these ideologies bring totalitarianism as the cloud, the rain. If you mean by ideology trying to build a pattern of thought who could allow soon the people of Egypt, the people of Libya, or the people of Russia today, which is the real event of the moment when we speak, to be more free, to invent their life, to respect the right of their opposite, and so on. Vive cette idéologie. Long live, long life for this sort of ideology. And we are in search and I am personally in search of an ideology who could contribute to the democracy building for the people who are coming out of the night of Putinism in Russia today, of Gaddafi in Libya, of Mubarak in Egypt, and so on. This is also an ideology. And I don't think at all that the alternative to dictatorship is a good Saint-Simonian bureaucracy or technocracy. Of course not. In other words, the democratic thought is not just a minimal thought. It is not just a ground zero of reflection. It can be, it has to be a very elaborate, sophisticated pattern of concepts which can be only in this case a real alternative to the world which is dying under our eyes.
You talk about Libya, and can you just sort of talk about your involvement in the Libyan campaign or prior to the Libyan campaign?
My involvement in Libya was just from day one to last day, to wish with all my heart, with all my forces, to put all my forces in the battle of the victory of an uprising which was trying to get rid of one of the most bloody tyrants of the epoch. So my involvement consisted in that, to contribute to the recognition of a rebel power, to bring in Paris, in the office of the president of my country, militaries, generals, rebel generals coming to ask for weapons, to take out of the martyr city of Misrata the three officers who did begin to liberate their city, to free their city, and I had the intuition that if we gave them the means to achieve that, they could also take Tripoli. So I took them out of Misrata, I brought them in Europe, and I think that I contributed to the fact that they were taken seriously and armed for freedom. So my contribution was that, to wish to act with all my heart for the victory of freedom in a country, in an area of the world which was supposed to be condemned to slavery. Because don't forget that. 1 year ago, everybody, every pundit, most of the academics thought, some glad of it, some not glad of course, but all of them thought that the Arab world was antinomic of freedom, that there was a sort of unwritten diktat of eternal history which condemned them to eternal slavery. There was a sort of Arab exception, and this was denied by facts, and this was great news.
So finally, what role does, I know this is a big question, but succinctly, what role does language have to play fighting tyranny?
What role language has to play?
Does language have to play? And not, formulation of ideas or transmission of ideas, but what role does language in and of itself have to play?
In general, you mean?
In general.
In history, in Libya,
in Libya and for the future. And in what you do, I suppose.
As I told you in the beginning of our conversation, my deepest belief, I don't want to be pompous, but my ontological creed is that we are made of words, of language. that we are human beings because we are devoted to language and because we act as guardians of the language. Devoted to it, aimed to it, inhabited by it, haunted by it, guardians of it. This is the ways we have, all of us, to be human beings. Which means, on the reverse, that if we stop to be the guards of the language, if we stop to be, if we let us inhabit by something else than language, by inarticulated noise, let's say, by what Heidegger names le on in French, then what is disappearing, what is vanishing, what begins to decay in you is the real human part which you bear. So, language or barbarity? That in the 60s there was a group in the 50s and 60s called socialisme ou barbarie, socialism or barbarity, barbarism, barbarity. I would say today, language or barbarity. If you take the language out of my mind, I am just, as the etymology of the word says it, by the way, in Greek, you are a barbarian. Out of language, you are a barbarian. And I saw it so clearly in so many circumstances of my life. When, you know, the parable of Billy Budd, sometimes a crowd becomes Billy Budd. A crowd becomes speechless. A crowd becomes as if a sort of bad exorcism took language out of it, out of the crowd. And then it is the mob, it is the pack, it is the lynching, it is the death of Gaddafi, for example, which was a terrible, horrifying moment. It is the reign of the sovereignty of barbarity. So, language or barbarity. And if I had an advice, a piece of advice to give to those who will continue to think after me, it would be that to preserve our humanity, which is not an easy task, to preserve one's humanity. The target, the real game, is to remain the guardians, the shepherds, to quote again a great philosopher, to remain the shepherds of words, of language. My grandfather was a shepherd. I am a shepherd myself, but I don't keep muttons, cows. I try to keep words. And I think that if you don't do that, if you misquote them, if you misuse them, if you treat them badly, then you really harm the world.
Thank you very much.